Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Absolutely pleasure to be here, Chris.
So, can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
My name is Kevin Kumpf. I'm the Chief OT Strategist here at Ciolo. And what I do is help the company understand the people process technology of our customers and work to build our technology and our platform to address their needs, not the other way around, where we build technology and say, here's what you want to solve for, and here's your needs. So that's my goal, is to keep that customers front and focused and mindful in our process.
And how did you get into the field?
It was sort of on a, hey, we have a job here in cybersecurity. I knew nothing about it. I wanted to change after owning my own organization and having staff globally for several years. And I said, sure, this is interesting. And I thought it was going to be more of the death by Excel audit compliance checking thing. And it turned out to be running industrial, or not industrial, but IDS, IPS, and firewalls for one of the global banks out there, building that infrastructure, and started from there.
Is that something like when you heard the job opportunity, you were like, oh, this sounds really exciting. I totally want to do this. Or was it, well, I guess I better do this if I want to stay employed?
It was kind of the latter. They actually had to call me 3 or 4 times and said, look, this is really fun. And I kept thinking to myself, fun back in the day was taking apart your own computers and building your own serial cables and stuff. It wasn't, we're going to give you a pager and put you on call 24/7. So I don't know many that have really gotten to cybersecurity from, my area that said, I wanted to do this for the fun. It was, you're here because you have to many times now.
And it often seems to be that, well, I mean, for you and I, when we were coming up, there was no cybersecurity degrees. Security was barely even a thought, let alone cybersecurity.
Yeah, and even going back further, even going through college, you had to be a mathematician. Everything was all math because it was an applied science. And I look now and say that most of the people that I deal with couldn't even figure out where the calculator is on their phone to bring up to add math to do gratuity on a dinner bill. So it's totally changed the realm. But I think one thing that we have an advantage of over many coming out today is we learned by the hard knocks. We didn't learn by the taking the certification and saying, I'm here, I have knowledge.
Mm-hmm. The practical experience of I tried to do this and it didn't work, or I did do this and it did work.
Yeah, and that's really part of where I think my role comes in the organization, is being able to look at people and say, I've been in your shoes. I've been on your side of the fence. I've been the CISO of a major multinational utility company, on the operational technology side. I've dealt with major manufacturing companies building their infrastructure program where, day one, they said, hey, by the way, we have malware over in this robotic cell zone, but don't worry, we're not going to let it out, as their solution.
We're just going to keep the bad stuff over in the room over there. We're not going to talk about Bruno.
Exactly.
So, one of the questions I try to ask my cybersecurity guests as we begin the episodes of, have you ever been either personally, professionally a target or a victim of a cybersecurity incident and or a scam?
Yeah, first off, let's be fully transparent. I've had all my credit card information stolen, just like everybody else out there. I think it's a cottage industry and a badge of honor if you haven't at this point, but everybody has. But yes, when we actually bought our house back a bunch of years ago, going back in the old forge, I actually had somebody forge my signature, go to the bank, and actually put our home up for sale, and we had realtors showing up at the door.
Oh, fun.
Because they had signed the paper trying to sell our house. And that was just because I had actually written an article about real estate and the cybersecurity around the process. Somebody decided to say, hey, let's see if your mortgage company will fall for it. And they did. So victim by choice, I guess.
That is always the challenge of kind of being in this space and being vocal about something, is if you stick your head up, sometimes you get bonked by the mallet.
Yes, very much so.
So today we're talking a bit about supply chain hacks, supply chain issues.
Mm-hmm.
And not supply chain in terms of boxes on boats necessarily, getting from one side of the world to the other, but on our technical infrastructures. So, what do you see as let's kind of jump in with what do you see as the biggest issue? Well, you know what? I'm sorry. Let's explain what is supply chain.
So you brought up the point about it not being the boxes on the boats and things like that. But that is directly correlated to this because when they attack a third party, a vendor, a supplier, generally it's for something that they're providing for you as a service or a component that really aligns to it. And so when I look at supply chain, I don't want to say it's just third party risk for many people. They view it as that. But when you look at the entire spectrum of the organizations that have been attacked out there, and there's thousands upon thousands these days, as you know, it's really about their downstream suppliers and their attacks on them.
Is there? I have a good example that I'll get to at a later point in the discussion. Um, Part of the question is where do we not realize that the supply chain actually exists?
I think it comes down to ownership. And that's probably one of the biggest areas is if you look at it, third party risk or control over your third parties or your suppliers overall isn't something you want to get into many times because you're assuming their risk. You're assuming if you tell them what to do and something happens, they can point back to you just like and said, he told me to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the downstream challenge though is with this is that you tie your systems so tightly together today. You're now going to the cloud where all your data is shared between all of your suppliers. And when that data is compromised for one, it has a ripple effect to the other where now you have access to the information, to credentials many times, or to enough information to cause a disruption or a ransomware in the environment.
It is so I'm kind of thinking like as we discussed, there's multiple categories of this. If we're talking data, there's the data risks, there's system risks,
Yep.
there's operational risks. Things physically stop working or people get control of stuff. How do you even start to figure out how to deal with it?
I tell people one word, baseline. And if you look at, Chris, what a baseline is in the industry, I don't care if it's your own people, process technology, or somebody else's, you have to know what your I's and O's are, where your interaction points are, what systems talk to what systems, and what data is being exchanged. Mm-hmm. Sadly, if we look at the cloud, many things are now in the cloud where third parties aren't even third parties. They're the person that says, I do this, but they're on behalf of somebody else that white labels a service for them that does it on their behalf. So knowing your baseline of who is responsible, who's, as they call it, throat to choke is key. But you have to know that. If not, you'll never assess or posture properly.
So how do you do kind of that assessment in terms of how do I reduce? I know you don't necessarily talk about risk per se in a who's responsible for the risk, but as an entity, I want to reduce my risk. What are the kind of the concepts that I need to be looking at in how my systems connect and who I deal with and how I deal with them?
So you do want to take and understand where the components or data or other information fits into your business process. If you look at your primary business and you say, let's say I'm out there doing manufacturing or doing, the production or transportation of even data, information, whatever it is. The key point is that knowing how critical that information is, not only to your business at that moment in time, but if it went away tomorrow. And I tell people this very clearly is, nobody worries about what they put on their cell phone today. They throw everything on it until your cell phone won't boot up in the morning and then panic sits in because you don't know what's on your phone. And you think that, well, I'll just recover it through the network. And they've sort of put it off to say, I'm trusting somebody else to be there for me. Mm-hmm. Well, you have to treat yourself as the network. You have to turn around and say, look, if my phone fell in the lake tomorrow, what would I lose? How do I recover it? And how do I make it so that I can function tomorrow just to walk in the store and pick up that device and say, this is my new phone? And in theory, that is the supply chain, because the phone to you is an area where all this data intermingles and comes together for you, but you're not in control because
Yeah.
we've given up control.
I like the example of, for people who are not in this space, that your cell phone is supply chain. A
Well, it
perfect
is.
example of supply chain. It's stuff that is important to us, but we don't have control over any of it, in a sense.
Exactly. Exactly. And so you say, how does that differentiate in gradients? Well, let's take it if you were traveling today and you had an airline ticket. You expect your ticket to be on your phone. You expect Wi-Fi to work when you're at the airport. Now people have turned around and said, you know what? I know the Wi-Fi is not going to work. I have to screenshot this, make sure it's on my phone. But if you look at your own email account, it's like I can go to my computer and grab this and I can do that. So it's different levels.
Yeah.
Other things that are out there, I mean, I can guarantee that my wife has accounts that she can only get into with a PIN that she knows into the bank to do a credit card, doesn't get a statement, and expects the bill to be paid because they notify her. So if
Hmm.
that notification doesn't come in for people today, that is truly supply chain. It's an ecosystem of the whole process working together and what happens when it breaks or a component is compromised.
And is some of the challenge in this space of not knowing either when something has been compromised or when something has even totally failed until you're trying to backtrace it? This other thing that's very public has now failed, and you're trying to figure out why.
Exactly, exactly. And this is that intersection point of we all put in, let's take the logical level of firewalls. You put a firewall between your network and your partner's network, right? Well, everybody knows the firewalls are just mirrors of each other because the port's open on one side, that's on the other. Where's your real security coming out of that? It's you've got them there as a checkbox. But then that data going back and forth, there's many times that people don't even know it's being transferred when and where and how.
Mm-hmm.
Give you a real world example of when I was back in the banking industry. We had an employee that was going to retire and he was a little disgruntled with the bank. And this was back when they had mainframes. They still do, but the mainframe AS400 jobs were scheduled to run every single week like clockwork. The code hadn't been touched in 15, 20 years. He went in and modified the code so that the day that he was leaving, it went out and issued basically blank checks to senior leadership and gave all the lower employees different pay amounts
Oh,
back when
gee.
the checks came out. And nobody checked the system because every week it ran, it stuffed the envelopes and out the door they went. And nobody knew how to put the script back because he was the one that wrote the code for it and didn't know where it was buried in the JCL and other languages that were controlling the process.
Oh my goodness, that must have been a nightmare to figure out.
It was. And the funny part about it was at that point, he was retired. He had actually already moved down to the South Pacific and set this to go basically 2 weeks after he left.
Oh,
But this is where you trust a process. And then when something breaks, it's how do you find out about it?
yeah. I have kind of my own weird story. It seems a little similar to that. Um, so I run whatismyipaddress.com, and I get this support ticket from someone saying, "Why is your website using my browser to mine cryptocurrency?" And at the time, there were popular plugins that you could put on your website to use your visitors' computers to earn a little bit of cryptocurrency, in theory, in exchange, instead of doing advertising on the site. And I was like, well, I'm definitely not doing that. And this guy he must be mistaken. That it must be his computer. I'm sure his computer's compromised, and it's not me. And so I look at the site, and there's no. I look at the HTML code on my back end. And I'm like, there's no cryptocurrency miner here. I don't have anything to do this. And I thought, well, let me just run a trace on visit the website, run a trace, and all of a sudden, yep, there's a cryptocurrency miner running. And I'm like, well, nothing on my side has been compromised. All my files are right. There's no cryptocurrency in here. And I started to do the fun web developer process of stuff is let me just start disabling third-party products one at a time and see if this thing goes away. And lo and behold, there was a third party vendor that I had a script on that had, I don't know what it was at this point, and I don't remember now what the specific script
Yep.
was, but lo and behold, I disable their script and the cryptocurrency miner goes away. I know that they're not in the cryptocurrency space, and so I disable the script, email them, say, hey, something's going on. They say, no, 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 all of our stuff is fine. We've checked. And I'm like, well, you need to let me put it back on, visit my website. Yep, it's happening. And they go back and they just keep going down their supply chain and their vendor's supply chain. And someone somewhere along the line got compromised. And the bad actor inserted the cryptocurrency miner in a script that has just slowly rolled up through multiple vendors coming out to the public.
Yeah, and I encountered something very similar. I was hired to help an organization do their multi-cloud environment and really build their process for fedramp and things. And the first day that I was there, I said, "Can I just sit here and watch your environmental parameters and variables and system performance?" And I'd been told, earlier that when a basically an instance gets up to 85%, we kick off another instance. And so I kept watching, and there was two instances out there at 97%. And so I called over the team lead and I said, "Why are these two at 97%?" And he goes, "Because they're busier." And I exactly, Chris, that head shake of, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I thought your process was for 85%. And they said, "It is." I said, "But those are 97." And he goes, "I get that." I said, "This isn't Spinal Tap because it goes to 11 as opposed to 10. This is you're deviating from your baseline." Well, those were crypto miners.
Oh,
He didn't even know they were out there being used. And he turns around and goes, "Well, we'll just kill them off." And I said, "Okay, is it in your code?" Because they were building everything with Terraform and stuff continually. And it turned out that the code release that they put out 2 months earlier, that nobody ever took down the old ones, basically terraformed crypto mining into them.
oh.
And then again, it's back to knowing your code that you start out from. And that's, I think, part of the biggest problem we have as an industry is we go back and keep grabbing open source or other code again and again and again. We back up redundant images. You go ahead and clean up a breach. And they say, "We'll go back to a copy 6 months ago." And it's like you reinfect yourself.
You go back and reintroduce the, hey, clean slate with the door wide open.
Exactly. So it's not shocking to hear your story.
I mean, what makes me I don't know, discouraged, disappointed, disillusioned, all sorts of D words here, is how does someone actually solve the problem or deal with the problem if it's not mine, and even if my partner's doing the right job and their partner's doing the right job, and it's 16 partners away, and it all rolls up into what goes onto my website, in my example,
Yep.
how do we deal with this aside from not trusting anybody and rewriting everything ourselves?
Well, everybody wants to go out there and do a third-party risk assessment, but then how many times have you done those and it came back and it said we shouldn't trust these people, and the entity you're with says, "But they're the only supplier for this, and we already have a contract for this much money, so can we pretend we didn't have that done? Or it won't happen to us, trust me." The other part is contractually, where you have to put in, if you're farming out a service, you want to know where that service is. And I tell people, if you really want a long-term job in this industry, from the cybersecurity perspective, get in contract review. Because it's the things you don't ask in a contract that are assumed and implied are the things that kill you.
So, what are the things that we're not asking that we should be asking?
What they do in their environments. Do they share their data? Do they themselves use any third parties to do any of these resources, outsourcing, or anything else? Who owns the code that they're creating for us or the applications that are out there? What is their system redundancy plan if something happens in their environment? Where's your data being shared? And I was talking about this the other day of the new world of IoT, which I love to call Internet of Threats, not Internet
Yes.
of Things. But if you look at these devices now, this is a prime example of third-party data going out there that nobody knows about. And yet there are places out there like the big cloud providers that are now starting to collect it, get diagnostics out of it, and starting to sell that data. And it's an area I call digital rights management.
Yeah.
And so now you're going to see even more data out there. Now, is it a supply chain for me and you? No, but where does the supply chain come in? If I've got all my lights in a facility that are now being managed remotely by an application and a provider for energy efficiency, I've had customers say the lights in my facility went off. What happened today? And it wasn't well, somebody turned off the switch. Somebody actually breached that third party because that supply of light energy to you is a supply chain.
Yeah.
And you didn't know where the management system was or what the data is doing. And good luck having a contract for it.
I'm kind of laughing because I'm thinking about just all the things in our life that are connected to something.
Mm-hmm.
And whether we are an end user or a small mom and pop business, a medium sized business, or a Fortune 500 company, I can't imagine how many devices, pieces of hardware, chunks of code, software applications are sitting places that people just don't think that they are or don't even realize even exist.
Look, they are. And in fact, there was a recent news article about a home appliance where a man out, and I believe it was in California, started looking at what was using so much bandwidth. And it was one of his home appliances that was phoning home to tell the manufacturer what was going on with it. And I'm like, is there anything in your agreement that says no? What's your option? Take your dishwasher or appliance back? It's almost implied now that you are feeding the global supply chain of data,
Mm-hmm.
irrespective of whether you want to or not. And yet asking what that data would be is impossible.
Yeah, the person at the local big box store doesn't know what data your refrigerator is sending back to the manufacturer. I sometimes even wonder if the manufacturer even knows what data is being sent back.
No, and if you look at the components that come in for these environments, to build these appliances, they're not built by LG or Whirlpool or anybody else. They're common components that are sourced from one supplier or two. And we've had this in the power grid where um, even if you look today about, you want to talk about true supply chain risk. If you're talking about environmental components for RTUs, for PLCs, for other things, key components in, all of our industries. Where does that firmware chip come from? One source or two, and where are those sources? China or other places that are unfriendly nations to us. How do you know what's in those chips?
That's a scary thought.
Until one day, maybe it's a date down the road here that somebody says, just like my friend that stopped printing the, change the checks. Hey, today's leap year and this year, whatever day, we're going to turn you all off.
Mm-hmm. So what do we? So before we go down the massive the global shutdown, post-apocalyptic discussion, I don't think that's where we want to go today.
No,
What are the practical things that we should be doing?
it's really working with your third parties to understand um, how important their data, their information, their components are to your process. Building that bridge across that, yes, you need the legal and the contract to say you must do this, but really coming together and saying, look, we trust you because you're a partner of us, but things are going to happen. If something does happen between us, how do we work as a team to figure out how to resolve this and to get us up back quickly, to get you restored quickly, and to put some faith around things for leadership, management, elected officials, or anybody else based on the size of this, that we can handle this and restore with
Mm-hmm.
confidence. And that's where the teams really come in. It's when you have this, they're a third party, they're arm's length, we don't trust you mindset. That's where a lot of the problems begin.
Mm-hmm.
It's closed doors. We have to open doors to each other. I want to say like we've done technologically, but as you can see technologically, we've opened many of the doors, uncontrolled. Let's find it on the human side to start controlling it.
Do you see this as a need for kind of governmental regulatory compliance, or should the industry and industries, I guess, self-regulate and get out ahead of it before the government comes along and says, this is the way you're going to do it?
If you look at government regulation in its purest form, it's always after the horse has left the barn.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at it in another purest form where you talk about thou shall do this, thou must do this, it's always the interpretation of what does thou mean or what does shall mean or
Yeah.
how does this apply? And so you're seeing so many organizations out there today throwing out legislation, requirements, edicts, and then you read the fine print, it's like, well, we need 3+ years to get this implemented, and then we'll have our first audit 6 months later. That is not going to do it, but it's the only way that organizations out there spend the dollars, because you can't get an organization that has things that need to be done to keep the lights on saying, I'm going to take money for this and worry about the boogeyman.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, when you look at it from a political perspective, even though we're passing regulatory things and such out there, one of the key components is, if you're a local politician in your hometown, Chris, which is going to get more votes for you? Filling a pothole that the people drive through and complain about and feel every day, or putting money to cybersecurity that they can't see, they can't feel, and they assume that everything's good anyways, and if not, it'll come back up like magic. Where do you get the votes?
Yeah. And it's always challenging because you have people potentially making decisions about technology and concepts they don't understand. And you hope that the cybersecurity experts are involved in writing the legislature, but we know that, politics like to throw the little pieces into these things.
Yep. I remember my first cybersecurity meeting where I was in to be the cybersecurity lead on a project. I walked into the bank meeting, with the two banks that I was working with. And the first person said, "You must be Kevin." I said, "Yep." He goes, "Where do I sign?" And I said, "What?" He goes, "Sign my acceptance and of risk so you can get out of here." And that's, Chris, that's not far off. I mean, how many meetings did you go in to say, where do I assume the risk? Where do I sign off because I don't want to deal with security to slow down my project?
Yeah.
But I ask too many questions.
Ask questions, ask questions, ask questions.
Yep. But the key point is, if you look at supply chain, it's about asking questions. It's not about the regulatory that's going to fix it tomorrow. As I said, it's about partnering, peering, and asking questions and being able to accept the answers you get and realize that, the world's not going to stop for cybersecurity whether we want it to or not. But then how do you build that defense and depth around it and compensating control where you can look at your baseline and say, what's acceptable risk?
So you're baselining the risk, and you're baselining, kind of like you're talking about before, is the servers aren't going to run over 85%. My normal bandwidth isn't going to be this, and these are kind of the red flags that something needs to be looked at.
Yep. And then if you look at the physical side of supply chain, we've gone to so much just-in-time manufacturing things out there that I was working for a manufacturing company, and they put all their money and security and things into their biggest facilities. And we had wheels that needed to go onto some farm implement equipment. And one of their suppliers that provided O-rings for a fitting for this vehicles got breached. And they could not guarantee that the material and the process that they made were quality at that point. And so they literally had to shut down and wait for 40 some odd days for parts to come in. And in the meantime, they've got these multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment coming off the line that they can't even put the tires and stuff on. And so they had to build up another building to hold these vehicles just because the 5-cent widget down here wasn't important to them. But yet all the security went into the big building down here of putting out the product.
Yeah. It is an interesting. I've always found the physical supply chain really interesting, particularly throughout the pandemic. We realized that just in time is often just not in time.
No, it's not. And if you want to truly look at supply chain, it's really, as we've talked about, an ecosystem here. So I'll give you an example. I was doing some work for a poultry company. Somebody had posted an image out there of one of their process machines out on the internet. Somebody came in, took that image, doctored it a bit, and sent it through an email to management saying, I've been into your systems, I changed this parameter, pay me this money or I won't tell you what I've done to your systems. They had to immediately go into shutdown mode, recall all the product because they weren't sure what had been done to it out there. Was it properly cooked, anything else? But then now, the Food and Drug Administration, all the Department of Agriculture, all these type of entities get involved because now it's critical infrastructure.
Hmm.
But now, if you look at the supply chain out, it's like, all right, well, we're not going to get product to the stores. Look at the supply chain you're impacting down the other way. You got all the chicken that's showing up now to be slaughtered for this. You've got the trucks that are bringing it in. Now this food can't be used. What are they going to do with it? Do they dispose of it? I mean, what about the people that are raising the chickens? They've got their next one to come out to you on this day here. Just that trickle down to the real supply
Yeah.
of where it comes from, the ground up is really where your supply chain is, be it data or product.
Yeah. I like the thought of not just looking at your supply chain backwards, but looking at it forwards in terms of, okay, if I have issues, what happens after me in the process, and not just assume I'm the end all be all, and it all stops with me, and that, hey, if I'm down, it just affects me, but realizing, hey, if I'm, I think if we're thinking of I'm a electricity
Mm-hmm.
delivery system, I understand that my job is to make sure I get electricity a downstream.
Yep.
But if we don't view ourselves as critical, then people will get their product or service from someone other than me. But that may not always be the case.
Yeah, and there was actually I forget the exact instance, but there was a recent news article about electricity that said that suppliers cannot be held liable. And I want to think it was related to ERCOT and the winter storm in Texas, where it said suppliers cannot be held liable for not providing enough energy because it's an on-demand type service. It's not viewed as a must-have
Yeah.
service. And clearly that approach and mindset is because you're saying you rely on me, but if I have a problem, don't rely on me because I'm not legally challenged and capable to say, yes, it's my fault.
It's a very messy system out there in our lives.
Very much so.
So as we wrap up here, any parting advice, resources that people should be looking at, recommended reading?
As I said, we started this. There was a recent article out here, and I've given you the info on it if you want to publish it towards the end, but just some numbers that I think people need to understand. If you look at 0 days for the supply chain overall, 72% above the previous record. We had 3,205 attacks this year. But if you look at the other side of the coin, they said that, hey, the number of individuals breached went down. We went down to 353 million and some odd from 425 million. You're getting to the point where it's like, well, what's 500 million people?
Yeah.
And that to me is scary, is when we can take a positive and say, well, it's not going up to 500 million. It's going down. That's scary.
Yeah. I seem to remember a report saying that while there are more 0 days out there, less of them are being exploited. Is that your experience? I mean, in that, like, okay, yes, there's a 0 day vulnerability on this piece of hardware,
Yep.
but you can't get to it unless you're, well, let's just be ridiculous, unless you have physical access to it. So even though that 0 day exists, it isn't really an imminent threat unless someone has physical access to the device.
That is true. And that's in the space that we work in where it's really compensating controls. And that's really knowing who can come up to it. Because I say you physically can't get there from the outside world, but now you're seeing people infect an email or something like that that infects a laptop internally that then goes and talks to the device.
Yeah.
So unless you're a complete standalone isolated computer or technical component that there's nothing IO related in and out, that compensating control can only go so far. What we are seeing more of in the exploits is a deeper understanding of what the core technologies they use are, the protocols, the ports, the services. And it's easier for us now to tune up firewalls and things like that or other technology to say, I'm going to look for this. Problem is, if you don't know your baseline, you don't know what that difference is.
Yeah. You don't know. Yeah. If you don't know what to look for, you don't know what's normal. You're not
Yeah,
going to find what's abnormal.
no, exactly. And that's where it comes back to knowing your baseline is, if you're going to find a 0-day, it's going to be announced. We saw this with SolarWinds and others where it's like, hey, we patched it. And then, hey, we thought we patched it. And then we really thought we patched it. And it was all because they didn't understand their baseline of what was truly going on in the product.
Everyone just go back and look at every line of code on everything that you've ever touched.
Actually, yeah. Actually, I look and I say, you know what? Fred Flintstone and those guys had it right. Just carry around your own slate, and then when you're done with it, turn it into rubble.
I think that's a great place to wrap it up for today. Kevin, if people want to find you online, where can they find you online?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm a couple of the publishing sites out there for a couple of the other media sources out there, Chris. They'll be on my LinkedIn profile, or at Ciolo lecturing the circuit and doing things like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Very welcome, Chris. Thank you.